I think the impact on the profession has been pretty significant. If you think about CPOs and chief procurement officers, chief supply chain officers, the more of them I talk to, they tell me they've never been in such demand, and frankly, their credibility has risen significantly. And that's probably because most businesses discovered that many of the challenges that they had in the pandemic were in their supply chains. And you need the professionals to be able to manage that supply chain. And it was very often procurement and supply professionals that had to come up with the solutions to some of the challenges that businesses were being impacted by. So yes, this has become a boardroom topic of conversation now, and you find more and more procurement and supply professionals being involved in the strategic decision making of those businesses, which is then allowing businesses to leverage the value that procurement can bring. And some of the actions that we've seen coming out of this have been very much around understanding not just how you can manage your own liquidity and manage your own cash, but also looking at your supply chain. I mean, there's no good sort of making sure you're in a really good place, only for your supply chain to let you down. So what we found is procurement and supply professionals really putting time into understanding the financial health of their suppliers.
With companies' attentions now really turning to redesigning supply chains, rethinking operations, thinking obviously still about the bottom line, do you think ethics and sustainability could be somewhat compromised a little?
There's a perception that sustainability or initiatives around sustainability cost money. I'm not sure that's true. I think good sustainability decisions are good business decisions. Think about reducing your consumption of water, reducing the amount of electricity you use, or reducing the waste that comes out of your business. And those are all good sustainability decisions, and they all save money as well. I think what we will see, though, is differences between different businesses. So think of consumer-facing businesses. You find sustainability is very much in the DNA of those customers, and really because increasingly consumers are in part taking their purchasing decisions based on the approach of that brand owner to ethics and sustainability. And I don't think you're going to see that change. And if anything, you might see more of an acceleration in terms of focus, particularly on sustainability and addressing climate change. There might be some other businesses that find themselves in a more short-term focused way of thinking and a more focused on conserving cash. I think that's unfortunate because at the end of the day, I think that focus on sustainability and ethics is absolutely what society is looking for today.
Looking to the future now, where do you think procurement leaders should really be focusing their attention and their efforts? And where can we rebalance skills to really address these challenges?
Yeah, Sharon, I think you're going to see different things on different timescales. So I think initially, what we're going to see is much more of a focus on, I guess, what I'd call sourced for resilience rather than source for cost. And that requires people to think about new sources of supply, maybe a bit more onshoring, a bit more nearshoring, but never losing focus on the fact that value is incredibly important. You see, I would say that resilience and value are completely compatible. Resilience and cost are not necessarily compatible. And then the change that we're going to see in skills is going to be a shift in skills, I think, more towards collaboration, more towards transparency, more towards skilled professionals that can find ways of getting creativity and innovation out of their supply base. But more than anything, we're going to need to make sure that we've got the right people with the right skills in the right job to address the issues that many organizations are facing in terms of their supply chains, which have been hugely impacted by this pandemic.
Malcolm Harrison, many thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I'm joined now by...
Well, good afternoon from here in Dubai, and good morning or good evening to you all, depending on where you all are in the world. My name's Sam Achampong. I'm the Regional Director for CIPS MENA, which is the Middle East and North Africa office of the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply. Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to look at what's happened to supply chains as a result of the global pandemic and how you can rebuild them. To take you through the subject, we have the Axis group, who I'll introduce you to you shortly. If you do have any questions during the session, please type them in the Q&A box below, and we will answer them either during or towards the end of the session. We will set aside adequate time to address all of your questions. So, without further ado, let's make a start. And I'll now hand you over to Kubus, who will take you through the presentation. Kubus, over to you.
Thank you, Sam. And it's really good to be here. So I'm going to just share. And you should now have that in front of you. So my name is Kobus van der Walt, and I'm the CEO of Axis Group International. And today I'm going to talk about how to build a global supply chain after COVID. But that's already the first problem. We're not really after or post-COVID in the full sense of the word. I think in most regions, most countries, most industries, we are all still grappling in some form with COVID. And we all realize that this is going to be something that we live with for a long time. But nevertheless, today we want to focus on this question of risk and cost. And I must say, I really find good alignment with what Malcolm Harrison just talked about. He talked about resilience and cost. And I think loosely we can equate the way that we frame it here and what he said in a similar manner, or equate that. I'm going to talk for the most part, but I'm going to get some valuable support from Rachel Wu, our MD for Global Procurement and Supply. And she has a number of sourcing hubs and sourcing offices around the world that supports her on a day-to-day basis with different teams. But also Kalyan Samadar sitting in India, in Delhi, who is in one of those offices, who is our GM for Global Procurement and Supply for India and South Asia. So definitely this is a big topic, so I've wrote in some support. But just to share the perspective that we hold, Axis Group is an imperial company, and everything we do is about global markets connected. We have 3 businesses, one of which is Global Procurement and Supply. And I'm going to talk mostly from the perspective of what we have seen and done over the last year, and hopefully share some useful insights, and hopefully also get a bit of an exchange towards the end. Essentially, what we do is integrated sourcing and supply at a global scale, global procurement services, and also a lot of involvement in capital project procurement for clients literally worldwide from multiple sourcing hubs. And it's really a story of 20 years of experience offering an integrated solution. So in all of that, over the last year and a half, we've worked with clients that went through very difficult times, supporting that and learning lessons, solving. Of course, through all of this, we are driving costs down, managing quality, scheduling, and dealing with risk. And during these turbulent times, this has been a tumultuous phase, I think, for everyone. So we look forward to sharing. So the departure point is this notion of risk and cost. And perhaps one can talk about, on the flip side of the risk, one can talk about resilience. But first of all, let's look at it as a risk. And what we are seeing in our client base is everyone is saying, we need to look at the future differently. We need to think differently about risk and cost, and the interplay between these two. We need to understand in a different way and look through a different lens when we think about that. Now, of course, if you're driving the business of procurement from the financial angle, driving costs down can often shout very loudly. However, if you're the operations director who wants security of supply, the question around risk and quality and so on is heard very loudly. And that was really, really tested over the last year. And what we are saying is, if you want to revisit this risk and cost equation, you need to know, what does that mean for your business? And if you want to change, what are the alternatives? So for example, if you're sourcing from country A and you see it as too risky, or that you don't have the visibility that you would want, What other regions do you look at in terms of the product manufacturing complexity spectrum that is out there globally, adjusting at all times? And if you are having a spend cube with certain dominant categories, what product clusters do you then need to look at instead of your incumbent position that you come from? And this is going to recur throughout this conversation. But before we really launch into some of the sub-elements, just to say that we're really at a point in history, I believe, given the change, the disruption, the shocks that we've lived through, where all of the questions around why are we doing global procurement and running global supply chains, where are we running them, what are we looking at in terms of the categories, and how are we going to deliver on that? All of these questions need to be re-asked and re-answered. And even very fundamental questions, such as the make versus buy question. Are we going to still offshore, or are we probably already in a place where we need to reshore from a previously offshored destination? Or are we potentially too concerned and we're bringing things back to a nearshore location, or indeed onshoring, because you really want to be able to see it through the window and touch it? Also, questions such as the global sourcing models, which countries, which suppliers, what engagement models. This is what we mean when we say we're talking about building a post-COVID supply chain. We need to address all of these. And it's kind of like solving multiple different pieces simultaneously for it all to work. So between me and my colleagues, we're going to briefly talk about strategy and tactics in a new world of risk, and then talk about some of the cluster and category choices out there. What do we see now in terms of opportunities and shift? And then again, aligning a little bit with what Malcolm was talking about in the video earlier, the question of what skills and capabilities are very prominent in this new world. So to start off with, I can just say that clearly there's a multitude of risks that are converging. And the question is now what? Clearly complexity and dynamism. If we cast our minds back to the end of 2019, we had a certain set of risks: global trade war, a US election 12 months down the line, some geopolitical tensions here and there as per normal, technological shifts and an intensification of technology impacting the world around us, and of course, environmental challenges. All of those risks still live with us, but the arrival of COVID, as it unfolded first as a health challenge and crisis and a full-blown pandemic, with the disruptions, the first order disruptions, and then the second order disruptions, and then ultimately translating into huge economic dislocation, unemployment, job losses, certain industries grinding completely to a halt, and all of the fallout associated with that. We're still living with that. And for many places around the world, it's still getting worse. And the spin-offs of that, or the unintended or unexpected consequences alongside that, are significant. And as expected, as history suggests, the geopolitical quakes are there, because you've had this significant shock at a national level, global level, economic level. Then geopolitical tremors are never going to disappoint. They're going to be there. And this is the world we're in, where we're now entering a world where there's an amalgamation of risks. Can we cope? How do we adjust? How much worse will it get? Does it get better? How does it get better? And this is a key part where we need to understand in our business, in our company, in our industry, in our market, are we in a situation where we're stretching a piece of elastic string, or a piece of string that might snap? And also in certain areas, is there a pendulum that will swing and correct and swing back and find a new equilibrium? So we really, in many ways, in a dangerous tipping point scenario, or are we really in a soothing equilibrium scenario? And different industries, different markets will experience this very differently. And this is down to the teams that will assess, have the risk radar, have the contingency plans, have the probabilities and the impact scenarios and the activities that can rescue and remedy when things happen. So that's where we're in, or where we're at, and what we're going towards next. But more than that, And I think this is where we as leaders, as professionals, as practitioners really need to make a contribution. And we can do that given the importance of supply chain in this environment, where further out, a new history is being written with deep tectonic shifts that we're only beginning to understand. It's not just about what is happening through the window in terms of port shutdowns and travel, disruptions, but deeper adjustments of global supply chains, and understanding the way we think and those around us, and the way we do things, and the way we live, and the way we work in a so-called new normal too, means that we're going to have to lead differently and build supply chains differently. More of the same is not going to work. That is very high level, but at a very practical level, what we can also say is that clearly all organizations have their suppliers on the one end and their customers on the other end with all the internal processes. And across that landscape, it's becoming more complex. And we need to have the right people driving strategically, operationally, tactically, and develop a complete understanding. And this means there are so many information challenges that we need to get right and that we need to meet and in order to have the decision support to achieve success. And that is going to be a recurring theme as I go forward. So whether it's from your first, second, third tier suppliers to your first, second, third tier customers, your own complexity and cost must be managed with these indirect logistics chains on either side. And everything is in flux. And every time there's an improvement, there is a setback. And this means if we're running global supply chains, we're going to have to do a different level of health checking. We're going to have to do a different level of data analytics. We're going to have to do different supplier development methods. We're going to have to look differently at end-to-end logistics. All of that is what is at stake here. So I would say we cannot build a checklist. We need to draw lessons from what happened in the last year, that black swans do exist, that you must get the basics exactly right, that you do have to appreciate the interconnected things at all times and take a holistic view at all times and rethink all those natural but bad habits so as to shape a new thinking where we preempt and anticipate, think naturally at a global level, naturally seek visibility, and think very carefully whether mitigation cost in the supply chain is too dear or actually perhaps rather a good investment. And this can only really be achieved if we drive a culture in the procurement and supply team and the overall organization that can meet the demands. A checkbox list cannot save us. It needs to be the hearts and minds, human ingenuity as the antidote that really gets it right for us. So that means organizational culture. So if we then think at a top level in the organization, what can make a difference before we go maybe look at a more practical implementation level? First of all, procurement and supply must be at the top table. We've heard this many times at conferences and seminars. I always say that, but it is really now proven that it is an integral lever in risk, in value, in every aspect of the business, and it needs to be at the top table, near the board level, in the board level, exco level, and really be part of that multi-departmental functional management of the business. Secondly, information as a strategic lever or strategic intelligence is really super important. And organizations are all constrained for information. They have legacy systems that are not interoperable. They're reactive. They don't have the people that are focused on that because they're all busy with day jobs that keep them busy. But that is really a differentiator. If you get the information and strategic intelligence right in the current environment, you can outcompete your competitors. A third one, which is a very natural one would expect, is just the supply portfolio. Which markets matter most? We come from a 20, 30-year history where many countries became the top exporters and they're the incumbents. That is changing. And COVID has exacerbated that re-ranking, and we need to be on top of that, whatever categories we are managing in our spend profile. And then fourthly, the technology people interface is superbly important. And technology becoming pervasive, and even more so in the last year, means that we need to rewire the way we think and do and get that magic combination right. Now, that's easy to talk about, but how to drive initiatives and processes, steps, practical steps in organizations to get that right. And then the final one on this segment is just strategic partnering. The world is a big place. There are too many variables, and we cannot do everything on our own. No organization can. And we need to have those partners in place before we need them. So these are some very high level thoughts. But if we then go to a more practical level, where you need to think how to act on a day-to-day basis, I'm going to hand over to Rachel to share a few quick perspectives.
Thank you, Cobus. It's a bit difficult to cover all the elements under operations, but today, 6 key messages from my side to share. Supplier engagement. Supplier engagement has become a completely different concept under COVID. From one side, it's super important to bond with your supplier, form strategic relationship in order for them to prioritize your orders, especially when the category is short of supply. But equally important, from the other hand, you also need to frequently check on supplier health, which was also touched on earlier. Quickly move to logistics. It has become the most, were the biggest barrier in global supply chains under COVID. We cannot address enough how important to have a global logistic service provider with the following elements in-house: international logistics, inland logistics, air, sea, and rail logistics. Under COVID, with so many uncertainties, you need to frequently change plan, and one contacting point without outsourcing and outsourcing again will be very efficient to support. And we actually now, especially under CAPEX project procurement context, often hear that project owners joke about nowadays they spend more time in logistics than procurement itself. And why? Maybe, Cobus, we can quickly go to the next slide. Cobus? Cobus, are you there? Can we quickly go to the next slide?
Yes, I'm trying to shift it. Hang on just a second. Apologies.
Yeah, technologies, as Cobus mentioned. Okay, here we go. Great. So this is a simple chart, but it does illustrate the logistic cost increased from the beginning of COVID until now. This is the generalized index for containerized sea freight from major port of Shanghai in China to other major destinations in the world. You know, as we can see, it is over 200% of increase. And for some specific routes, especially from China to USA, it's even 3 or 4 times increase so far. And we often see our teams, you know, in different regions fighting for containers, fighting for vessel and airspace on a daily basis. It's like a battlefield. So, you know, it is very important that you have the right people in the right function, and then also as procurement practitioners work closely with logistics function and other functions within one organization in order to perform procurement job itself. And very quickly move to supply chain visibility. It is not enough anymore if you only know where you buy from. In other words, your direct suppliers. You also need to know their upstream and their downstream. In other words, where they buy from, their subcontractors or raw material suppliers, and their supply chain, their logistics downstream, whether they can actually move the product to the port for you. And inventory management has become a quite hot topic recently. For example, some major players or major corporates in USA and South Africa now already changed corporate policy to increase strategic inventory or stock for strategic raw materials to 4 to 6 months. And the used popular JIT model is now perhaps more a question mark under COVID. Cost and resilience, it has been repeatedly mentioned also earlier in the session. Perhaps as procurement practitioners, it is our nature to save every single penny. However, under COVID, even though under cost pressure, when we try to support the organization, we still do not recommend that we save every single penny. There are cost elements that we cannot and we shouldn't save. For example, QA/QC, to have on-the-ground partners to do final inspections or even during production inspections are super important, especially when you cannot see or touch the product under travel restrictions. Lastly, sustainability. Yes, we are all under pressure. Yes, we face a lot of daily challenges, but we still need to carry the governance in procurement forward. Sustainability, visibility, ethics, and so on and so forth. And perhaps here also a reminder to all of us. Again, maybe later under Q&A, we can unfold a bit more, but for now, back to you, Kubis.
Thank you, Rachel. So indeed, and as Malcolm also talked earlier about ethics and sustainability, so I'm glad that we also flagged this because it is truly that important. So if we then go on, so we've now talked a bit about a world of risk that is changing and what we need to do at a very senior level in the organization and maybe some more practical day-to-day activities. But what does this then mean for us to think about the cluster choices and category choices that we need to make? So first of all, we look back to say 20, 30 years. We say, for example, the United States was the leading trade partner for many countries, to where we are currently, where China has become such an important trade partner for just about most countries, and indeed is typically one of the top 1 or 2, or perhaps not much lower than that, number 3 in terms of any country's imports. How will this look in the future? And I think there has already been an adjustment where low-cost countries come into the picture, China being a very dominant version of that, but other countries in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe, in parts of South America, and potentially in the future, more and more out of, say, for example, Africa. But this is where it gets very complicated. Offshoring will still continue, depending on where you're at, where you are in a region or in a certain industry. But there are clearly already certain developments where someone who offshored to a country previously are now seeing risks or cost pressures, and there is some reshoring taking place. There's also the potential for some nearshoring or onshoring, and even fundamentally on the back of COVID, where some supply chains were so threatened and proven to be so vulnerable and not ready or agile or in a situation to deal with the uncertainties and the supply risk and the dislocation, where the entire buy versus make decision is being revisited. And this really just ties in with the next segment for us, that this question of risk and cost must be understood. Even if we got somehow through the last 6-12 months, let's not relax. Let's not become complacent again. Let's future-proof how we look at clusters and categories. And I want to start off here in this segment by just saying clearly the leaders in global exports are changing rapidly. If you look over the last 30 years, one can see that in the top 30 exporters, the role of China, certain high-income economies, and new emerging challengers have shown significant dynamism. And this will not end. This will continue. So what we see, for example, is that countries such as Portugal, Denmark, Finland, Ireland, Norway, Sweden, Indonesia fell out of the top 30 somewhere along the way. And new entrants have been, for example, India. We've had Poland, the UAE, interestingly, Czechia, Vietnam, Turkey. Now, as these countries entered, it means that obviously they've displaced those that have fallen off. Some have stayed in the top ranks, either in the top 10 or in the top 30 at least. And this is a dynamic that continues. And COVID clearly has only exacerbated this trend of the re-ranking. So China clearly has come from number 19 in 1990 to around about 2010 became number 1 and is still number 1. And it's also interesting that the US, Germany, Japan, France, Italy, the UK have actually stayed in the top 10. But several other countries have either fallen out of the top 10 or out of, as I've said, out of the top 30. This must be understood for which clusters will prevail, will remain the incumbents, and which ones will not. And this is a big, complex data exercise if you have a significant spend cube to manage and understand, but it is necessary to do. So if we just very quickly, for the sake of brevity, look at, for example, the UAE or Saudi Arabia or Egypt, we can see that similarly on the import side, these 3 countries, and we can do this for any country. In fact, we have done this for most countries. The import partners have shown significant change, and that change is becoming more intense. So similarly, then, as one sees the export rankings change, we're seeing the countries that import, which is just the flip side of that, being re-ranked dramatically. That means as procurement managers, as those that manage inbound supply chains, we need to understand that we are really running and pursuing a moving target. And to remain competitive, to be able to tap into supply, we need to not just look at our feet, but look ahead, look at the horizon and the next horizon to understand which are going to be the emerging clusters that matter most for our categories. So there briefly, Saudi Arabia, you can see significant, all of the black boxes or the black outline boxes or the orange boxes that you see next to each of the countries show how countries are re-ranking and jumping around. This is a significant demand on analytics and analytics horsepower, capability that most organizations simply don't have. So the risk and cost equation is a complex one. And so just briefly, Egypt. So if we then try to think about a methodology for approaching this, it's really to understand in our current inbound supply chains, where are we buying from and what are the input costs in those countries and the macro drivers and how integrated are they supply bases? If we take China, for example, and then also what are the emerging alternatives? And by weighing all of this up, when we understand it, we can form a clear view on the key advantages that will persist in the markets that we buy from, and also categories and that we can still, place in those supply markets. But it will tell you oftentimes that you need to change, you need to adapt, that you're not getting the risk and cost equation right, and that you're not optimizing. And that is the challenge. That is the opportunity. So if we then move on, it's really about saying, yes, we've talked about risk. We now maybe can delve a little bit into cost and say, what are some of the top of mind cost factors to think about, and then bring it back to the alternatives once we want to address the risk cost balance. So on cost, just simple. If one takes, for example, China, which is a key supplier to most businesses around the world across industries, and we set its typical cost base, looking at, say, direct labor cost for managers, engineers, and laborers in a factory floor setting, for example, to 100, along with other natural gas, electricity, say warehouse or plant space, then we can see significant variability with countries like Mexico, India, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, quite a bit below those levels. We can even see that some are close to it and some just marginally above it. So if you, for example, in the US or Germany or Japan or Australia, or for example, a country in Middle East, North Africa, we can plot what is the relative advantage or disadvantage in buying from China or shifting to another country on this list. This must be understood to get the cost right. that we cannot move from a world where cost is not at all regarded as important. Competition forces us to get it right. But we can't only look at that. We also need to look at the risk, which we obviously talked about. And I think a good analysis, understanding the options, will help significantly in getting some cost understanding. If we then move on and understand that if we start to shift because of, attractive other cost levels in other markets, looking at a product manufacturing complexity spectrum for, say, high-tech, high-capital complexity products, or medium-tech, medium capital complexity, or even low-tech can help us. And then comparing, for example, where countries like the US, Germany, Japan sits short, medium, long-term vis-a-vis, say, China or India or other developing countries or Asian developing countries or even Africa. And this is an exercise that we spent a lot of time to say, how do we shift supply chains to new markets that matter, that help us future-proof ourselves? So I've included in the appendix all of these different metrics and measures for anyone that wants to pore over it later on when there's a little bit less of a time pressure. But this gives an idea of this. And then moving on, if we think of the product clusters, it's clear that countries like Mexico, Brazil, Poland, China, India, Vietnam, Turkey, that were not 50 years ago in the exporter rankings, perhaps not even 30 years ago, but that emerged in the top 10 or the top 30 in the last 10 to 20 years, are already exporters of high quality products. Not only that, but to countries that are very discerning and developed, which means that they have cracked onto the world stage fully and truly. And tapping that is an opportunity. Now, if we take China, for example, we've ranked its top 100 exports, and we know typically what China can offer. But we've also put in the appendix all of those countries, what their top 100 exports are. And that can very nicely help navigate to see that the alternatives, once you want to play with your cost and risk equation in terms of the complexity spectrum and the product clusters out there in the world, that there's a lot of room to maneuver. So where does that leave one? It leaves one with an equation where you constantly look at future cost increases or decreases and future risk. We can also equate risk here to implementability or executability in terms of tapping a new supply market, for example. And we will each have different views on this if we do our own analysis. But just by way of example, if one looks at China, India, Poland, Vietnam, and Mexico, we can plot over time historically and potentially in the future how cost might change. And we can also look at how risk might change, or we can form a view. But as Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially when it is about the future. So it's not easy, but this is what is necessary in professional and astute teams that do procurement and supply at the best practice level. And then with that, it means we can actually look at areas such as Northeast Asia or China or ASEAN, Southeast Asia, or India, South Asia, or Eastern Europe, or South Africa, or other parts of the world in a very informed manner. So to help again, I'm going to ask Rachel to come in and just comment a little bit before she will probably pass on to Kalyan. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you, Kobus. Considering time, I will try to be brief. So on the right-hand upper side of the slide, we start from China. China has been a long dominating player in global supply chain context or global supply context. However, in the past 2 decades, China has been increasingly more capable to compete in value-added or more value-added industries and categories, meanwhile moving away from lower value-added industries and categories. Of course, it has been driven by the enormous amount of R&D spent either from the public or private sectors in China. And we all heard the story that, in the past, other countries or developed countries often sue China for IP infringement. And then later on, Chinese companies start to sue each other. And more recently, Chinese companies started to actually sue other countries for IP infringement of their own. So that shows you how much China has becoming more capable in technology, in higher value added manufacturing. And of course, manufacturers in China also went along the same path, and they also do vertical integration to the upstream to secure raw materials, and also expand into logistics. And all of this help China to compete in value-added industries. For example, using mining as an example, yellow metals, HME, and also OTR tires. Used to be dominated by international global players, but now China is actually quite capable. But the homework for us to do is which category and which supplier in China to supply. Of course, there are also the downside when China move from lower value-added industries, but please, let's be careful. China is not completely withdrawing from those categories or industries, rather more focusing on premium products in those industries and then leaving the lower end products or market to other countries. And Southeast Asia is a very different story. And of course, in the past 10 to 15 years, it increasingly become an alternative supply when we look at the global procurement. However, Southeast Asian countries actually do stand out, especially when you consider raw material cost benefits like rubber, steel, and so on and so forth. And if you bring in duties, to certain destinations, Asian countries definitely does enjoy more advance compared to China. For example, truck tires from China since 2014 would have over 100% of anti-dumping tax in USA, but not for some Southeast Asian countries. However, when we look at Southeast Asian country supply, we need to understand what categories that they are more ready for, because there is a constraint in terms of product coverage and also supply capacity. When you look for a wide range of basket and when you look for a large amount of supply within short term, sometimes Southeast Asia and China might be both your solutions. So having that said, I'm going to pass the floor to Kalian to touch on India. Kalian, please.
Thank you, Rachel. As Rachel rightly said, China is undisputed leader in the global sourcing. But China is moving up in the value chain and leaving some void in the market. And to capture that void, many countries are trying there. India, Mexico, Vietnam, and Poland. And out of these countries, we think India has the strongest possibility to capture some of the market. Why we're talking about India is there are many reasons. The huge talent pool we have, the skilled, unskilled, semi-skilled, the availability of raw materials, the energy, water, and so many other things. And on top of that, the recent government initiatives, Make in India, Skill India, connecting the roads, connecting the ports, these are all helping India to develop as a global sourcing hub. While we're looking at these opportunities, we should not forget about the ground realities, the risk and the challenges. The biggest risk in India is our diversity, be it the language, culture, the way of doing things. It's very different in different parts of India. The infrastructure is still not ready, especially the logistics sector. Bureaucracy, red tapes, and all these things are still there. But still, if we look holistically, the advantage, the opportunities are much bigger than the risk. And we believe the opportunities are real, the opportunities are big and significant, and India's story is very relevant. And the time is now. Now is the time for India to come up. Having said that, the challenges are also real. We should not forget that. And we have to manage the challenges and risks. How we try to manage it, I will give a small example with a case study. and we'll go into details how this risk can be managed. Okay, yeah. Cobus, next slide, please. The case study. Okay. Imagine you are a purchasing manager in an oil and gas company in Dubai or Sharjah. You want to buy some casting product. It's a MRO, non-standard engineering product. So probably how you look into it, you first look at your local market. Probably UAE may not have many casting companies capable of doing this. So the next option probably you'll look at China. And as Rachel already mentioned, China has moved up in the value chain, and many of the Chinese good companies, they are not looking for small MOQ. So you naturally look into India. And when you look into India, after all your research, you'll come to a very interesting conclusion. Therefore, this kind of material, there are just 4 clusters where most of the casting companies are. On the north side, we have Delhi NCR region, where you'll find a lot of casting company. On the west, we have Rajkot and that area. On the south, we have Coimbatore. And on the east side, the Calcutta region. Okay. These are information easily available on internet. And based on that, you can find a supplier and you can go ahead with the transaction. Now the question is it the real value or best value out of India? This is the best you can do from India. What about the risk? How you balance the risk? And to understand that, we have to go much deeper. It's not only the Google search and internet search. We need to understand the local context. There are many, many factors to look into it, but because of time pressure, I'll talk about 3 elements. The first one is understanding the ecosystem. Second one is having the right people. And third one, we're talking about agility. I'll just add only one sentence to each of this because these are big topics. For ecosystem, we need to understand, say for example, Delhi, Rajkot, Calcutta, Coimbatore. Are they have the equally developed ecosystem? When you talk about ecosystem in supply chain, it's all about the partners, not only the suppliers, but also supplier of suppliers, the logistic company, the local transport company, the third-party inspection company, shipping company, all this. You will be surprised. Not all the 4 clusters will have equal competence. So that's very, very important. And on top of that, what kind of relationship you have with the partners? That's very, very important. The second element I talk about people. To do all these things on the ground, you need the right people. And there are many, many things about right people. Skill is one part, but another important part is, are we providing the support system? Are we providing the right technologies? So that will help to move these people. And third one, in India, surprises are very common. So how agile is your system to manage those surprises, those uncertainties? And especially when you talk about India, the surprises, important thing is you have to do the right thing at the right time, at the right speed, because the window of opportunity will be very short. Within that, you have to do it. Now you will ask me question. My company is sitting in Dubai. How can I do all these things in India to get the real value out of India? One short answer is you need to have on-the-ground capabilities. When you talk about on-the-ground capabilities, we talk about having your proactive partners, having the ground capabilities at the strategic locations, not everywhere in India. India is very big. You cannot afford to have people everywhere. But at the strategic location, to understand the local context, local dynamics, and behave as a local. This is very, very important. The second thing is in India, we need to proactively manage the relationship with our suppliers. And what we call this as transaction ready. So that for most of the major categories, you have good relationship with your suppliers, you have good relationship with your logistic partners, transporters and other things. So immediately you can act on a transaction. Now you'll ask me whether as a company in Dubai this is possible to set up. Commercially, it may not be viable because of economies of scale, but it is viable for a company like us. And we believe in this capability building, and we're investing heavily on India to develop this on the ground capabilities because we strongly believe in India's story. Thank you. Back to Kobus.
Thank you, Kalyan. So what that means is we need to understand in our journey as a business doing global supply chain, are we still offshoring to certain markets for the first time? Are we already reshoring? Are we bringing things closer, for example, in the Mexico-US context? Or indeed, are we bringing things back onshore? Are all of these opportunities available to us? And what all of the above then means is that this cost and risk equation must be understood. It is a big challenge, but it must be understood and it must be managed, it must be dealt with. We do need to look at the world globally as a set of clusters with fit with our categories that we are pursuing. And there are many choices to make. And finally, we can do this in an ignorant manner on the one extreme, or with full strategic intelligence on the other extreme. If we do the latter, that will enable us and make the difference. And to wrap up, very close to the end now, is to do all of this is complex. There's no getting away from that. There's no cutting corners. So skills development in procurement and supply teams have never been more important. In fact, our clients tell us that they are competing for a limited talent pool. And it's about organizational capabilities to be future-proof, to be ready for the next. And also that reach can be gained only with the right partners. So whether you are in the early stages of managing the supply chain, looking at which countries and which markets to tap, or whether you've already selected the clusters and the countries, whether you're engaging in analysis of suppliers or deep supplier engagement, or even already transaction management, there are going to be all these different tasks. And you need to find your focus of where you are the most weak and vulnerable, and where you need to invest to get stronger. And having the right skills and corporate capabilities will then enable you to do the analytics, the strategy, the portfolio of suppliers, complexity management, negotiation, contract management over long distances, cultures, time zones, quality management halfway around the world, supplier performance, supplier development, and of course, integrated end-to-end logistics management. No one will be perfect, but knowing where you are weakest and what you need to go and improve to get through the challenges. And then last slide, if we bring this all together, is simply to say that the world has shifted, and so has supply chains. This is not going to be over tomorrow. It's probably going to become more demanding, taxing, and complicated. And that means we need to pursue a balance between risk and cost, or can I say resilience and cost. And we need to therefore have an agile supply chain that is resilient. If we're not there today, we're not at best practice. And that implies visibility, it implies end-to-end management of the supply chain. And we can achieve that as organizations only if we have the leadership at the top, but through all organizational layers. If we use strategic intelligence well, and we focus on the right things right, meaning find your weak areas and fix them before it's too late. And then get the people enabled and skilled up and capable, and the cross-functional collaboration and integration must work well, whether it's the operations, the finance department, legal department, contract department, procurement department. That world of collaboration has arrived. And yes, we are going to understand that we're in an ecosystem with stakeholders all around us, and partnerships matter. And definitely China will continue to be very important and still dominant or prominent in many supply chains. But we must also develop new markets that matter, and then get our cluster and category choices right. So with that, Sam, I'm going to pass it back to you and just say that in the appendix, which we haven't even presented, we have mind maps on why, where, what, and how to source globally, on a full list of product manufacturing complexity spectrum data, export clusters that matter, and also some export champion profiles, the top 100 exports for all of those countries, which we would be happy to share with people that are interested to look a little bit more deeply. And with that, I'd like to thank Rachel and Kalyan, but also thank you, Sam, and thank you, CIPS. Thank you very much.
Guys, incredible. Thank you so much for that. The great amount of information considering where we are in the pandemic, and potentially where we can get to, and what the opportunities are, and most importantly, some practical ways in which we can continue to navigate and be on the upward curve as we come out of the pandemic. So thank you very much, Axis Group. Let me look at some of the questions we have. We got barrage of questions coming in, and we'll take as many as we can in the time that we've got. So first question from Abdullah, and the question is: a major learning curve from COVID-19, especially in Saudi Arabia, is to localize manufacturing of critical materials used by companies in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia or consumed within Saudi Arabia. What's the advice you've got to streamline this concept of local manufacturing and to maximize this direction?
Yes, so a lot of countries are looking at this, and whether it is something critical like PPE and COVID response supply or other strategic telecoms and other examples, everyone is rethinking this. Leaders in government, countries, industries. However, there are constraints, and those must be understood. For example, strategic raw materials into becoming a bigger industrial base. Understanding whether the skills are there, the technological prowess, and how easy it is to absorb and diffuse technologies into a system. So really, I think it is about picking winners, prioritizing those aspects of manufacturing, and putting the policies in place and the enabling business environment so that public and private can work together to expedite and accelerate the establishment. But the reality is that this may take time. And in some cases, trying to do too many simultaneously may create risk, and some or many of those initiatives may fail. And this, of course, is in an interconnected global world where all countries are now starting potentially to create subscale manufacturing, competing for the same international raw materials. And there becomes, there are some competitive tensions, and economies of scales are not necessarily met. All of that said and done, there will still be, I think, a general reassessment for time to come on those super critical manufacturing that needs to be right, in the home market or on the doorstep. And that requires, again, strategic intelligence, but then good strategic program and project management. And that is now the world in the next horizon that we live in. So it will create new skills requirements. It will create new jobs, new job titles. And then in the end, in the fullness of time, a new way of global competition.
Great answer. Thanks, Kubus. And I think that really addresses that question fantastically. And so basically, it's a kind of halfway house, isn't it? It's, local manufacturing is not a silver bullet. It's not going to change your fortunes overnight, and it's not going to mitigate 100% of your risk, I think is what you're saying there, Kubus. I'll take a nod. That will do. So the next question was after the COVID-19 pandemic, do you think the just-in-time model is still valid?
I think it's still valid in the sense of its theoretical base and the concept, but one probably has to have a COVID adjusted or risk adjusted view of just in time. And that may simply mean that just in time does not apply in some cases in the one extreme. In the other extreme, it will perfectly apply because people are going to rewire supply chains and already have. So I don't think we need to go now and throw out all of the principles that we held dear, but simply revisit, reassess, and think, is it practical? Is it pragmatic? And can we create hybrids? Because if you're sort of ideologically based around a management concept and say, yes, I believe in it, or I definitely now don't believe in it, I think one is probably not that pragmatic. Go and look at it on its merits and the specific context in which we want to apply it, and I think test it in that. So I actually think that the basis of it will still exist, the economics, the efficiency, but the risk side of it, and that is fundamentally the risk and cost equation that we kept on repeating over the last hour. So yeah, I think it's inconclusive. It will live on, but in a hybrid form, and which will be context specific.
That'll be interesting to see, to have a kind of a hybrid of just in time, and I suppose a hybrid of just in time is just that you have adequate stock, which I guess is an antithesis to just in time. But we'll see what that actually means. But great, thanks for that answer, Kubis. Risk and cost. Let's talk about risk and cost. What do you see as the top risks now that are common to most organizations? And I know there's an element of hindsight here, but in your opinion, what are the top risks that are common to most international organizations and across industries? Which risks stand out?
I think there's an interesting answer to that from my own perspective. I look at certain communities worldwide that have been hardly affected by COVID. They've been few and far between, and they've been very fortunate, but they do exist. Secondly, a lot of areas that were heavily affected and recovered, people have become complacent and sort of returning to the old ways. So those two groups of people are actually not going to learn seemingly that many lessons. And I think that's a big risk. Secondly, I would say information, how we look at information and how we process it and turn it into a usable strategic intelligence lever, a decision support lever. We seem to not yet get that right. And if, for example, if you did that well, you could go back to the previous questions you asked about just in time, for example. We still in an old world, an old economy, but we're also emerging in a technology dense world with AI, machine learning, and so on and so forth. But we're sort of straddling these two worlds, and we're not fully yet in that world where we know how to deal with information and strategic intelligence the way that we probably will in time to come. But some organizations will be ahead of us as we compete with them, and they will be dangerous. So that is a risky place to be, where you have a leader in the industry that outcompetes you on the basis of how they turn information, available information internally, externally, into strategic intelligence and decision support quicker than you can. That would be number two.
Great. Awesome, Kubis. And I think tying the three things together, if we talk about, just in time and also risk, which are also tied to specific locations. And previously, most of the things we were talking about were centered around China. And I guess during COVID-19, when most organizations were reliant on China to a large degree, and China was the first major geographical location to be affected, I guess. The rest of the world followed quite soon after. But going forward, coming out of COVID, where is there a next China in terms of being the source or the central location for commerce, I guess, for economic engagement?
Sam, I don't think there is the short answer. I think rather there will be a constellation of other areas, contiguous areas with a few countries or regions of countries, or just regions and countries, clustered together, industry hubs, with good cluster activity in and around them. And that is because I think just data-wise, there's no economy the size and speed of China. India is a much smaller economy, growing rapidly, but it's still so far behind. It's not going to be there, infrastructure, technology, size, scale, scope, anytime soon. So that's not a real contender. But if you look at India and you look at Vietnam and you look at Poland and Turkey and Czechia and Mexico, these are now viable options simultaneously. Meanwhile, China is still there, whether it is the textile industry or chips, or whether it is anywhere in between. I think people are looking more at a portfolio approach. Remember, we had China sourcing, China plus one, China plus two, LCC, best cost country, high value country. And I think we're really in an era now of global procurement, global supply. Some organizations will keep it simple and stick to China plus one for long. But those that are on the efficient frontier are already using data in such a way where they know which clusters matter to them. And they're watching what their competitors are doing. And they're looking not just at today and tomorrow, but they're looking into the future 3, 5, 8 years and positioning their value chains with new supply markets in mind. Also, as they look at their customer markets down the telescope. And I think that is a long-winded way of saying we're rather going to have many different markets that are being looked at, which comes back to complexity and multiple streams and skills requirements, which means CIPS will be very busy, Sam.
That's an interesting perspective. And I guess if on that note, if we talk about people, because we're talking about a new dimension, a new world order almost, and then you have the individuals or the professionals who work in the profession of procurement and supply. Is there an additional or new revised skill set that these people need to be able to function in this new world?
I think persuasion becomes very important. Having a strong leader that can bring the team together, harness the best of the team, but then also take the key messages to the top table and not just inform or make aware of, but persuade them of the strategic importance. So the voice becomes a skill, not just doing the work, but voicing and flagging the impact, the risk impact, the opportunity impact. Secondly, I would say just data in our day-to-day world and work and living it's becoming more pervasive. But when we speak to our clients, they go from the most sophisticated to really the most backward, and that entire spectrum. And I think there's almost a cutoff point where there's a tail end, where if you don't have those skills, you have really a big risk of becoming a dinosaur. So I would say so being able to leapfrog from the back to the middle or the front on how you look at technology, data, information to compete. And then just the final one would be complexity management, to do many different things across multiple supply chains in many directions, whether it's to Asia, to the Eastern European markets, Latin America, into Africa, different cultures, time zones, business systems, business protocols, different contract types, different supply chains and logistics chains, different regulations. And you're sitting there in your console with your team, and you're looking through the port, almost like in a spaceship, and you need to navigate this world because suddenly you are truly and truly engaging with the world. That, I think, is here. It would be too exposed, in my mind, to sit and wait for supply to arrive through an intermediary at a convenient nearby location, because intermediaries are becoming disintermediated by other intermediaries, and they also have their own business models to pursue, and that could come in conflict with my business model. So having that visibility to make strategic choices across your portfolio becomes really strategic and really important, and that means you need to have that complexity management skill set across your team. And they must speak many languages, and they must be able to do magic.
I think the magic part has always been a requirement for procurement professionals, but certainly the language element and the need to turn into a more strategic professional and to rely on those softer skills is a trend. And I think you've just validated it in your answer, so thanks for that. And I think in the interest of time, I think I'll just go to the final question, and that question was, how do we develop supply chains in underdeveloped countries, especially countries that have high inflation and which obviously leads to rapid changes in prices and process?
Look, we've all done that. If we're old enough, no one wants to give away their age, but we were doing China sourcing 20 plus years back when it was still novel, right? Today it's old hat. We've learned those processes, and some older people have done it for much longer. Certain core principles will not really change, and we need to know what that is, which is good, local knowledge, context. I think Kalyan talked about it. Rachel talked about it. Whether we're entering, frontier markets, say in Indochina, whether you're going to Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, or whether you're going into Central American countries or African countries that are still, with a much longer runway of development ahead of them, we're going to keep those principles: good information, good local context, good due diligence, and working and committing strategically and long term to suppliers that go from a universe list to a long list to a short list to a short list, and taking them on a journey or traveling with them on their journey and developing them. Because that's what we've seen, the big successes coming in places like China, and already for us as Access Group for a number of years in India and also Southeast Asia, and now targeting far more in Africa and, say, for example, Mexico. So it's just repeating that old process and getting it right, maybe doing it faster, quicker, modernizing the process, but the core elements of it, are there. Also, just trying to understand how can one use technology, not to go and learn all the old lessons that have already been learned by others, and just speeding up.
Oh, I think we lost you a second there, Kubis.
Hi, can you hear me?
I think we lost you for a second there, Kubis. Sorry, do you want to finish the last bit of your answer, Kubis? I think we lost you for a second.
Oh, really? So no, I think I'll keep it short, just to say that we can take some of the core principles: good information, good local context, and good due diligence, and traveling with suppliers in these emerging markets over the long term and developing them, because that's really an investment for the long term. Thank you.
Kubis, Kalyan, Rachel, Access Group, thanks so much for your information. Great webinar. And to everyone who attended, thank you for attending. We will share the relevant materials and a recording of this session through the CIPS portal. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your questions. Thanks for the interaction. And we hope to see you all soon. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.